Hey guys, I wanted to make a video talking about the composition and mixing process for a track of mine that's very different than my last video. The last video was very orchestral, lush, thick harmonic textures. This is essentially like a hybrid rock band, maybe orchestral punch in the face. So the production on this is a lot more involved than in the other one, and the composition is a lot less involved, but just to give a good perspective on how to approach two different types of projects. So let's start off by pressing play and listening to what we got. Cool, and then we fade out. Again, like harmonically, compositionally, at least in the classical sense, it's not nearly as complicated. The production is so much more involved. So to start this, I wanted it to be more mysterious, foreboding, and I didn't want to completely give it away. I wanted the audience to be surprised by this huge hit that was not an orchestra once we get a little further into the track. So it starts out with some string ostinatos along with brass and a very cool pad here from Heaviosity. But here's what we're doing with the strings. I don't know if you're familiar with action strings, but along with just different rhythms, they also have phrases. And what I'm doing here is I'm using this phrase, but I'm just repeating the MIDI trigger or the MIDI note for every 2 beats. So I just get this dyad going back and forth. But I really love the attack of action strings for all of their patches, so I just did this so I could use that for the track. And the whole time, action strings is just outlining the chords that are being hit by the brass. And this intro deepness pad synth is essentially hitting the root of everything. But let's go into the brass and see harmonically what's going on here. So I know we've got a D in the bass, and we've got a A and a D here. While it's not actually a D minor chord. With this, the violins are actually hitting the F. So overall, the entire, all of the layers create a D minor chord. From there, from D, we then go to B flat major. We're going to the minor 6, so B flat major chord. We then go back to D again, and this time, instead of doing B flat major, we go to an A flat diminished, which is a tritone from our tonic of D. So not only are we moving a tritone away from our tonic, but we're also including a tritone in the chord that we're hitting. So that one, I guess, modulation is very, very ominous, very dark. And then I also add the B a little later just to completely fill out the full diminished chord there. I do also want to take a second and emphasize how important using the mod wheel was when actually creating this. That adds that human element, that adds that swell in and out. And I want to say I'm using Symphobia. Yeah, this is a Symphobia patch. Symphobia 2 has some great brass section patches, so check it out if you're in the market for some brass patches. They also have a ton of other stuff from the entire orchestra. But once we hit that diminished chord, we then go back to our tonic, and then we actually go to a progression that's a little more involved. So we start with D here, and then we go to G minor, which is just the minor 4, very regular. It's more so to extend the phrase as opposed to really take it anywhere harmonically. But one thing I love to do is to repeat things, whether it's phrases or chord progressions or anything, but I love to just tweak them so it's the same, but it's not the same. And this is what I do here. So I start with D, I go to G, which is the 4, and then instead of going to B flat major, which I did before, the minor 6, I go to B flat major, but I do a B flat diminished chord instead. So it sounds familiar, it sounds like it works even though it's different. So B flat diminished. And then from there I resolve it to D, our tonic, and then a very straightforward dominant chord here, A major sus4, and then the 4 resolves to the 3. So it goes in line with very textbook straightforward progressions that they teach you in school, but then it adds a little twist to it too. And the whole time, again, I've got this awesome sounding pad going from Heaviosity. It just sounds incredibly evil. I mean, that just gives this kind of background texture to everything that's going on top of it, and it just sounds great. And I'm also varying the velocity because there are times where I want that bass, that sub to hit, and on this note I didn't. But for all the others, I want that impact. So I spent a lot of time deciding for all the notes that I'm not hitting with full velocity what the velocity needed to be, because this can vary a lot. Here, I'll just play it for you like. Those are all very low. I'm sorry, very high. So if I actually go lower, I mean, that's full velocity, and then when I just let this die out and tap it a little bit. Here. So there's a lot of variety in this one patch. So that part of it was very delicate. Once I actually go into, I guess, the big hit, the meat and potatoes, the track, I've got this section called Big Hit here, and that's essentially because it hits you right in the face. And I was trying to make this as much of a huge sort of sound as possible. So I have some angry distorted synths going on here. They're all doing different things to the sound overall, occupying different parts of the frequency spectrum, like we've got here. Even move this up so it's a little easier. So we've got that, kind of a little more muffled, mid-E, high-mid-ish. And then that to just add some sparkle up top, just to make sure that we've just got a brick wall of frequencies coming at you. At the same time, I've also got these drums down here that are kicking in the face as well. So when you combine all of that together, you get a huge smack in the face. In between each of those hits with that pattern going on there, I've got this pad going right here. I call it wiki just because it just sounded like wiki, not a technical term at all, but I just loved that rhythm, especially because it paired so well with the more straightforward hits from the large percussion at the same time. So it, the way they interacted, I thought was really interesting. So this kind of leads in, and it's not until we get to measure 25 here that the full force of everything actually comes in. While we got these huge bass drum hits, they're short, they're bass drum hits. There's no sustained deep sub bass that's really carrying it until we get to this section. Wiki patch that I'm using here, like when you have the subdivisions from the extra drums that come in with the hi-hats hitting all the 16th notes, it just interacts really well, and yeah, I loved that rhythm it created. From this point on, the piece is much more about creating texture and maintaining interest, and very little is done in terms of thinking about chord progressions or, you know, I guess more traditional compositional techniques. Here, I've got drums, I've got a bunch of sound design-y things going on at the same time as some drums, and the only melodic thing that's really going on is the bass, and I basically just have a cool bass riff going with all those other textures happening at the same time. So again, that's playing, and while it's playing notes, it's not really a melodic thing. It's just adding to this angry texture that's going on. I play through that once, and then I add a layer of some palm muted distorted guitar, which comes in here. And then I was a metalhead for the longest time, listened to a ton of hardcore music, and I heard this, and I was just like, oh, this is the setup for the breakdown. This is perfect. Just be at the mosh pit, and then... So that's where that came from. From there, again, I've just got a lot of textures going on, and the bass, once we get to this point, stops really being a riff, and it really just turns into like this foundation that everything is built off of. It's just going 6/7 tonic with a little riff here at the end, but there's not really compositionally a whole lot going on. I mean, that's your super straightforward 6/7/1 happening right there. At the same time, I've changed the riff that the guitar is playing. You can hear it here. And I also added another layer that's doubling it below, just so it has a little more beat. See how it feels like a little thin without it, especially when we get to this later section. And again, I'm just playing around with a cool riff there. There's not really a conscious thought of like what chords I'm in or what progressions or phrases I've played before, how I can alter them or use them again. I'm just really just improvising over that 6/7/1 in the bass that's going on at the same time with that huge drum texture happening. But here we get to the end, and then I have a ton of sweeps with synths and the drums drop out, and it leads back into kind of a restatement of the beginning part here with the huge drums. One notable difference that I want to bring up though is, as you see, it's copied and pasted literally from the beginning, but to just add a little more, I guess, of a sense of finality and also interest, I also included like a big, huge brass chord, just hitting a D minor in the background, just to give it an even darker tone, and again to give it that feeling of, one, it's different, and two, we're at the end. Super simple. And then to end it, I use that initial deepness synth pad, and I copy the rhythm of the big percussion and just slowly fade it out. Yeah, and compositionally, that's pretty much how this happened and my thought process behind all of it. So let's dive into some of the production behind it. For the drums, huge big drum hits, so I've got, you know, a couple different drum patches, and each of them, or some of them, yeah, I mean, like lots of drums, just making them as thick and huge as possible. So yeah, if we solo this. So big drums. When we actually get into, I guess, the meat and potatoes of the track, where we have the full like rock track drums going on, it's a combination of a couple different things. So I've got Damage here, playing this loop, and I'm mostly using that just to get the hi-hat. I love the hi-hat sounds that I had and the 16th note divisions there. I thought it was great, but I felt like the kick drum and the snare, which are arguably the two most important parts of the drum kit, weren't punching through enough, weren't standing out, so I ended up doubling them with some other patches. So here, this is another Damage patch, but you'll see what it sounds like when I remove this kick drum, as opposed to a thing. Like, it's just got a lot more low end moving throughout it and a lot more punch with it as well. And then the snare is here. As you can hear, when I take that snare away, it sounds really, really weak. And then I use this again to just add more variance in terms of the textures that I was creating and using. Like, I took out the kick drum here just because the track overall dies down a little bit, and you always want to have a direction that the track is going, whether it's lessening or increasing. You just want to maintain interest somehow. This being a trailer like piece of music, you always, for the most part, always want to be getting more intense, or at least give the illusion of getting intense. So since a lot of other layers dropped out or reduced at this time, I also took out the kick drum, and the kick drum dropping out isn't noticeable in and of itself because the whole track is coming down, but it also gives me an opportunity later to introduce that, maintain interest, and again create that arc of things increasing. As opposed to the section before, listen to the kick drum. It's there, but it's not that strong, and you'll hear a difference when we get to the next section. Not only did that add interest because it's different, but it also helped the kick drum punch through the mix because I introduced that distorted guitar, and frequency-wise, it wanted to occupy the same space as the punchy part of the kick drum. So reintroducing it, we could still hear the kick drum, but we could also hear this as well. And I guess that's a good segue into talking about the panning and EQ strategy for this track, because it took a lot of time and it was pretty difficult because a lot of these sounds have a lot of punch, they're super compressed, they have a lot of distortion, and because of that they're competing with each other a lot. So what I did is I automated the panning as well as EQ so that everything takes its turn as being the focal point. Like the wiki and the guitar palm muting were conflicting a lot. But I automated things, as you can see, panning wise. This starts a lot more towards the center, and then it moves off away to the left in the frequency, in the stereo field. And then this, when this introduces, that's when this moves. And then later on, I introduce another layer that's that pulsing synth that was competing with both of these. So again, at that moment, I move them further away from center. And because we're introducing a new element, that new element grabs your attention and the listener doesn't notice that this voice or element has moved off to the side. Just kind of a cool trick to keep in your toolbox in terms of keeping your mixes clean, clear, keeping clarity, and directing the listener's attention where you want. But let's listen real quick just through this. So again, this is going to start closer to the center. When this comes in, this moves a little to the left, and I want to say I automated the EQ of it as well. I think, maybe, possibly, yeah. So when this comes in, this automates so that we hear it. Well, you know what? Instead of trying to figure it out, let's just watch what this EQ does when this other element comes in. And remember, they were competing with each other pretty badly before. So when this element comes in, it grabs your attention, and if you were trying to pay attention to this, you can notice that there's a timbral shift You may even be able to tell that it moves off to the left a little more, but the average listener who's not told, hey, listen for this specific thing, is not going to notice at all. What it does is it makes it so this is still audible, but this also grabs your attention and sounds clear on its own, same as this. And again, we go through that section, we have the breakdown, and then we have a slightly altered middle section here, and then we essentially repeat something very similar to this in this section, but we're also introducing this synth, this pulsing synth. I want to say it's here, and I put it right in the center. So again, as different things are coming in, there's one layer, it's close to the center. When something else comes in, it comes in close to the center, and the, I guess, quote unquote, old element moves off to the side. And then when we introduce another element, we introduce it closer to the center, and then both the elements that were in there move further off to the side again. So they're still there, we can hear them, it doesn't sound empty, but we're directing the listener's attention where we want, to the center, to the new element that we're introducing. There's a lot more that I could say about the production of this, about doubling certain things, deciding which things to compress and not to. That would make this video entirely too long, and we're already at a half hour. So the one thing I do want to do is just talk about how at the very end here we have essentially everything's getting bigger and louder and higher frequency content, and you want to give the sensation of, you know, about to burst, but at the same time you don't want to destroy your mastering plugin and have it sound all distorted and get that squashing compression sound. So at the same time that you are increasing things that you want to have the listener's attention, always keep in mind that you have a lot of other elements that now are not as important, and they're adding volume and they're adding a lot of frequency content that you don't want to be the focal point. So make those go down. Let me see if I can find an exact example, because this is all stuff that's getting louder. There, I have a couple patches of rise and hit here. So that's all increasing, but the way that I avoid having things just sound awful is I have all of these low bass frequencies reducing in volume. So you've got less total overall volume at the same time that you're raising it for other elements. This also helps make the impact when we bring the percussion back in that much stronger, because all of a sudden we go from having no bass frequencies or relatively little bass frequencies to having a lot more. The other thing too is that since we have all of these rising synths and pulsing things, the vast majority of people aren't going to have their attention drawn to this bass coming out, because everything else is more prominent and grabbing your attention. Let me see if there's another section. No, maybe that's just the only section that I reduced at the end there. Let's see. Well, here, I reduced that. So at the same time as those other things are rising up, reduce the elements that you don't want to have grab the attention. It'll give the illusion that the elements that you're bringing in are even louder than what you had before, because they're getting louder and the things that you heard before are getting softer, but the listener is going to interpret it as, oh, these are even louder and more intense, that they're overpowering the other elements, as opposed to the elements are actually getting quieter and the things you're introducing are keeping the overall volume relatively the same. Just a trick. So again, not nearly as compositionally involved, but production-wise, it was a lot more difficult. I hope that this helped either composition-wise, mixing-wise, to go ahead and try and make some awesome trailer, hybrid, orchestral kind of stuff. Again, questions, comments, put them in the comments, and I'll see you guys for the next video.